Hey guys, dating in 1950s America is often remembered through soft music, bright dresses, soda fountains, and neat little rituals of romance. But beneath that polished image was a world of rules, expectations, silences, and quiet pressure that shaped almost every choice a young woman made. Tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support it. You can also subscribe for more calm, quietly fascinating history videos made for slow listening. So tonight, let's step into the world of 1950s American dating, not as a glossy photograph, but as something lived, negotiated, and often far more complicated than it first appears. For many women in 1950s America, dating did not begin as a private matter of the heart. It began as a public performance. A girl might be getting ready in her bedroom, fastening a skirt, brushing her hair, checking the shine of her shoes, but the meaning of the evening stretched far beyond whether she liked the boy who was coming to pick her up. Dating was tied to reputation, family approval, popularity, future marriage, and the fragile social ranking of teenage and young adult life. The strange thing, from a modern distance, is that dating looked freer than courtship had been in earlier generations. Young people went to diners, school dances, movie theaters, drive-ins, bowling alleys, church socials, and college mixers. They could sit in cars, share milkshakes, hold hands, and choose partners with less direct parental control than their grandparents had known. But this freedom had its own cage. The rules were not always written down, yet nearly everyone seemed to know them. A young woman was expected to be attractive but not vain, friendly but not too available, interested but not eager, popular but not careless. She was supposed to encourage male attention while making it appear that the man was leading. She had to be pleasant enough to be chosen, restrained enough to be respected, and strategic enough not to be talked about. That balance could be exhausting. In the years after the Second World War, American culture placed enormous emphasis on marriage, domestic stability, and the ideal of the cheerful home. The war had disrupted ordinary life. Millions of men had returned from service. The economy was expanding. Suburbs were growing. Consumer goods were filling kitchens and living rooms. Magazines, advertisements, films, advice columns, and school programs all helped promote a powerful image. The good life was a home, a husband, children, appliances, order, and emotional harmony. For girls and young women, dating became one of the main roads into that promised future. It was not simply about companionship. It was training. It taught them how to be charming, how to manage male approval, how to appear feminine in the accepted way, and how to move toward marriage without seeming too ambitious about it. This is one of the first misunderstandings modern viewers often bring to the subject. Dating in the 1950s was not just romantic. It was social sorting. It was a system that helped decide who was desirable, who was respectable, who might marry well, and who risked being pushed to the margins. In high school especially, the pressure could begin early. A girl who was asked out regularly gained status. A girl who was not asked might feel invisible. Going steady, wearing a boys' class ring, being seen at the right places, and having a date for major dances could all become signs that she was succeeding in the social world expected of her. The boy was often imagined as the active chooser, but the girl was judged just as intensely for whether she was chosen. And yet, she was not supposed to look as if she cared too much. A date often began before the boy arrived. It began with preparation. Clothing mattered. Hair mattered. Makeup mattered. A girl's appearance was treated almost like a language. A cardigan, a full skirt, a neat blouse, gloves for certain occasions, carefully curled hair, lipstick not too bold, perfume not too strong. Each detail helped communicate respectability. Even casualness had to be arranged. In many middle-class homes, the young man might come to the door, meet the parents, and state where they were going. The father might inspect him quietly. The mother might offer a warm but observant greeting. The girl's departure from the house was not simply a personal moment. It was a small family event. Everyone understood that her behavior outside the home could reflect back on the household. Once they were out, the rules shifted but did not disappear. The boy usually paid. This seems like a simple custom, but it carried power. If he paid for dinner, movie tickets, gas, or snacks, he was performing masculinity in a culturally approved way. He was showing initiative, resources, and leadership. But payment could also create expectation. A girl might feel grateful, obligated, or careful not to seem rude. The date was presented as generosity, yet it could subtly place her in a position where she had to manage what was owed without ever naming it directly. That quiet tension ran through much of 1950s dating. A young woman was expected to accept male attention gracefully, but also defend boundaries. She was taught to be appealing, but also responsible for stopping things before they went too far. If a boy was persistent, the girl often carried the burden of refusal. If she refused too sharply, she could be called cold. If she did not refuse clearly enough, she could be blamed. If rumors spread, they usually damaged her more than him. The double standard was not hidden. It was built into the culture so deeply that many people treated it as common sense. Boys were often allowed a wider range of behavior. Girls were expected to protect their reputations because reputation was closely tied to future marriageability. A girl could be popular and admired, but if she was considered too forward, too physically permissive, or too independent, the same social world that rewarded her attractiveness could quickly punish her. This made dating feel like a careful walk through invisible tripwires. The 1950s also produced an ideal of femininity that was cheerful under pressure. A girl was encouraged to be pleasant, agreeable, and emotionally smooth. Advice literature often told young women not to dominate conversation, not to correct a boy too sharply, not to appear too clever in a threatening way, not to complain too much, and not to make a man feel inadequate. This did not mean women lacked intelligence or agency. Many were perceptive, witty, ambitious, and deeply aware of the roles they were being asked to play. But the dating script often rewarded those who could hide effort behind ease. The best performance was one that did not look like a performance at all. A young woman might spend hours preparing, worry over what to say, consider how late she could stay out, wonder whether the boy would try to kiss her, and think about what her friends would say afterward. Yet on the date itself, she was expected to appear relaxed, natural, and grateful. The emotional labor was part of the evening, but it was rarely recognized as labor. There is a quiet irony here. The 1950s often praised women as the emotional center of the home, the gentle civilizing force, the keeper of warmth and manners. But before marriage, girls were already being trained to carry emotional responsibility in miniature. They had to make dates comfortable. They had to protect male pride. They had to monitor tone, pace, and impression. They had to make refusal sound kind. They had to make interest sound modest. Even silence could become a skill. At a diner or soda fountain, a young couple might look perfectly carefree. 2 glasses, a shared booth, music from a jukebox, the bright, smooth surface of American post-war leisure. But around them were layers of expectation. Other teenagers might be watching. Friends might report details. Parents might ask questions later. The girl might be thinking about whether this date meant another date, whether he liked her seriously, whether being seen with him helped or harmed her standing, and whether she was moving too quickly or too slowly by the standards of everyone around her. In this way, 1950s dating was both private and crowded. Even when a couple sat alone in a parked car, they were not entirely alone. They carried parents, pastors, teachers, friends, advice columnists, movie stars, magazine images, and future expectations with them. And the car itself changed everything. The rise of car culture gave young couples a new kind of mobility. Drive-in theaters, roadside diners, and suburban roads created spaces where young people could separate from the direct supervision of adults. For boys, access to a car often increased status. For girls, getting into a car could be exciting, flattering, and risky in social terms. It offered privacy, but privacy was exactly what made reputation vulnerable. A girl had to trust not only the boy's behavior, but the story that would later be told about the evening. This was one reason group dating remained important. Going out in groups could soften the pressure. It allowed girls to be social without appearing too serious. It gave everyone witnesses. It made romance feel safer, lighter, and more socially acceptable. School dances, church youth events, skating rinks, and parties created settings where couples could form under the watchful comfort of a crowd. But even group settings had hierarchies. Who arrived with whom mattered. Who danced with whom mattered. Who was left sitting mattered. Popularity could be measured in invitations, attention, and the ability to appear wanted without appearing desperate. For women in college, dating could become even more directly linked to marriage. Many colleges in the 1950s still treated women's education as valuable, but often within the assumption that a degree might make them better wives, mothers, teachers, or socially polished companions. Some women pursued serious academic and professional goals, of course. The decade was never as simple as its stereotypes. But the cultural pressure toward marriage was strong, and women who remained unmarried too long could be treated with concern, pity, or suspicion. The phrase, "getting your MRS degree," captured a real social expectation. College could be a place of learning, but it was also widely imagined as a marriage market. Women might attend mixers, fraternity events, formal dances, football weekends, and campus social functions where romantic pairing was part of the social design. The right husband could shape the entire rest of a woman's life. Her class position, neighborhood, financial security, social circle, and daily freedom. So dating was never only about whether a man was charming. It was also about whether he was stable, respectable, ambitious, approved by others, and likely to provide the kind of future the culture kept promising. A woman might genuinely enjoy a man's company while also weighing his prospects. This was not necessarily cold calculation. In a world where women's economic independence was limited by workplace discrimination, lower wages, and social expectations around motherhood, marriage was often the central institution through which security was organized. To understand 1950s dating fairly, we have to see both sides at once. There was real romance, real excitement, real affection, and real joy. Many women remembered dances, first kisses, phone calls, corsages, letters, and proposals with tenderness. But those moments existed inside a system that narrowed choices and placed heavy consequences on female behavior. The culture offered women a dream, but it also gave them a script. And the script was easiest to follow for those who fit the preferred image. White, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied, conventionally feminine, and socially respectable. For women outside that image, the dating world could be even more complicated. Black women in 1950s America, for example, lived under the combined pressures of gender expectations and racial segregation or discrimination. Dating, courtship, and marriage unfolded within communities shaped by unequal schools, housing barriers, employment discrimination, and the constant realities of racism. In many places, public leisure spaces were segregated or hostile. Respectability could become not only a personal concern but a protective strategy. The demand to appear proper, dignified, and morally beyond reproach carried a different weight when the wider society was already prepared to judge harshly. Working-class women also experienced dating differently from the glossy magazine ideal. Their evenings might be shaped less by formal dances and more by neighborhood gatherings, local cinemas, church socials, factory town routines, or practical limits of money and transportation. A boy paying for a date mattered differently when neither person had much cash. A simple outing could still carry meaning, but the polished consumer version of romance did not fit everyone's life. And for women who felt desire or identity outside the accepted heterosexual path, the dating culture of the 1950s could be deeply isolating. Public life assumed that women would date men, marry men, and build homes around husbands. Those who did not fit that pattern often had to hide parts of themselves carefully. The cheerful romance culture that seemed so visible in magazines and films also made certain lives almost invisible. This is where the nostalgic image begins to crack. The 1950s did not have one dating experience. It had many, but the dominant ideal was powerful enough that even people who could not fully live it still had to respond to it. One of the most revealing details is how much dating advice focused on female adjustment. Girls were told how to attract, how to behave, how to listen, how to dress, how to avoid seeming difficult, how to let the boy lead, how to keep his interest, how to prevent physical intimacy from going too far, and how to turn dating into marriage. Advice for boys certainly existed, but the emotional and reputational responsibility placed on girls was heavier. A girl might be told that men liked confidence, but not too much, intelligence, but not superiority, beauty, but not obvious vanity, independence, but not independence that threatened future domestic life. The ideal girl was a contradiction made to look effortless, and that contradiction followed her into almost every stage of courtship. Phone calls, for instance, had their own quiet rules. A girl might wait for a boy to call rather than call him first, because calling first could seem too eager. Families often shared one telephone, so conversations might happen within earshot of parents or siblings. Privacy was limited. The ring of the phone could become an event. Waiting could become emotional theater. Not being called could feel like social judgment. There was no texting, no private digital thread, no casual stream of messages to soften uncertainty. Silence had weight. A missed call, a delayed call, or no call at all could shape a girl's whole evening. Friends might analyze what it meant. Mothers might notice. The house itself seemed to participate in the suspense. And still, she was supposed to appear composed. Going steady added another layer. By the mid-20th century, going steady had become a recognizable stage in teenage romance. It suggested exclusivity, seriousness, and social recognition. A girl might wear a boy's ring, jacket, or pin as a symbol that she was attached. This could bring status and security. Could also limit her. Once identified as someone's girl, her social world narrowed around that relationship. For some, going steady felt comforting. For others, it could become a small rehearsal for marriage before they had truly understood themselves. The relationship might be watched by friends and parents. Breaking up could be embarrassing. Staying together could become easier than explaining why not. Here again, the 1950s dating world rewarded stability, even when the people involved were very young. The larger culture encouraged early marriage. The median age at first marriage dropped during the post-war years, and many women married in their late teens or early 20s. This does not mean every woman wanted the same life, but it does mean the social timetable could feel urgent. A girl who dated was not always simply exploring. She was often being moved, gently but firmly, toward a decision that would define adulthood. And once marriage appeared on the horizon, dating changed character. The question became less, do I enjoy him? And more, could this become a life? Would he be a good provider? Would he be approved by her family? Would he fit her religion, class, race, and community expectations? Would he want children? Would she be expected to leave work? Would she move? Would she become the kind of wife everyone seemed to be preparing her to be? The softest-looking parts of dating often hid the hardest questions. A corsage for a dance was not just a flower. It marked participation in a ritual. A formal photograph was not just a keepsake. It preserved evidence that one belonged. A boy opening a car door was not just politeness. It was part of a gender order. A girl laughing at the right moment was not just enjoyment. It could be part of keeping the evening smooth. This does not make the people fake. It makes the world they lived in structured. And perhaps the most important thing to understand is that many women learned to move within that structure with skill. They were not merely passive. They judged, chose, resisted, delayed, encouraged, refused, hoped, and adapted. Some used the rules to their advantage. Some found genuine happiness inside them. Some quietly disliked them. Some accepted them because alternatives seemed too costly. The 1950s dating world was not simply a prison, and it was not simply a paradise. It was a social stage where romance, reputation, gender, money, family, and future security all met under the glow of ordinary Saturday nights. And as we go deeper, the most revealing question is not whether dating was better or worse than today. It is what a young woman had to learn before she could even appear relaxed on a date. What a young woman had to learn before she could even appear relaxed on a date was, in many ways, an education in reading other people before reading herself. She learned to notice tone before words. A pause on the telephone, a slightly delayed invitation, the way a boy introduced her to his friends, whether he opened the car door quickly or distractedly, whether he suggested a respectable dinner place or a more uncertain drive somewhere quiet, each detail could carry meaning. Dating required interpretation. Often, the rules were never spoken aloud, but failing to understand them could shape reputation for months. Mothers, older sisters, aunts, teachers, and magazine columns often became quiet instructors in this education. Advice came in fragments. Do not accept a Saturday date too easily if he has ignored you all week. Do not stay out too late if you want to be taken seriously. Do not seem too impressed by expensive gestures. Do not talk too much about yourself. Let him feel useful. Be warm to his mother if you meet her. Never let him think you have no standards. Never let him think your standards are an accusation. Much of this advice was contradictory because the culture itself was contradictory. Women were told to pursue love, but carefully enough that it still looked like they were being chosen rather than choosing. They were told marriage was the great destination, but open ambition toward marriage could appear unattractive. A girl who wanted commitment had to make that desire visible and invisible at the same time. This tension was especially sharp around physical intimacy. The public mythology of the 1950s often imagines a sexually restrained decade, but real life was far less simple. Desire existed, curiosity existed, pressure existed, and young people found ways to negotiate all of it within a moral culture that insisted on appearances. Kissing, petting, and private time in cars were common parts of teenage and young adult dating, but the boundaries around them were heavily gendered. A young woman was expected to manage those boundaries. If things moved too quickly, she was often judged more harshly than the man. She was supposed to know how to stop a moment without causing humiliation, how to refuse without seeming dramatic, and how to protect both her own reputation and his pride at once. This was a skill many girls were expected to possess without ever being clearly taught. The emotional burden could be immense. Even language reflected this imbalance. A girl who had a reputation might find herself quietly excluded from future respectability, while boys often moved through the same social world with far less lasting damage. The same act could be interpreted as weakness in one and experience in the other. The double standard was not an exception. It was architecture. This helps explain why so many women from the era later described dating as tiring even when it was exciting. Romance was real, but so was vigilance. A pleasant evening often required constant internal calculation. There was also the question of money, which quietly shaped nearly everything. Post-war prosperity is remembered through bright advertisements and suburban optimism. But prosperity was uneven. Many families still watched every dollar carefully. A young woman's dating life could be affected by her family's income in subtle but powerful ways. Clothing had to be maintained. Beauty routines cost money. Participation in school dances, social clubs, and outings often required small expenses that could feel large inside a tight household budget. A girl from a wealthier suburb might move through a world of proms, country clubs, and college weekends that looked very different from the experience of a girl working part-time, helping support younger siblings, or living in a neighborhood where marriage was tied more directly to immediate economic survival. And for women who worked, especially before marriage, the workplace added another layer to dating expectations. Secretaries, teachers, sales clerks, nurses, telephone operators, waitresses, many women were expected to work, at least for a time, but often under the assumption that work was temporary. Employment was frequently treated as a bridge between girlhood and marriage rather than a long independent life. A woman who seemed too committed to career ambitions could be viewed with suspicion. Was she difficult? Too independent? Too intimidating? This created a peculiar social script. A woman might be highly competent at work, managing schedules, customers, or entire office systems, and still be expected in dating life to soften that competence, to appear less decisive, less professionally serious, so that male attention would remain comfortable. Competence had to be translated into charm. Many women became experts at this translation. They knew how to shift tone depending on the room. At work, they could be efficient. On a date, they might be expected to become lighter, more admiring, less visibly authoritative. It was not necessarily dishonesty. It was survival within a system that rewarded adaptability. The language of good girls and nice girls reinforced this constantly. These were not simple compliments. They were classifications. To be called a nice girl meant being placed safely inside the moral center of acceptable womanhood. To fall outside that description could affect invitations, introductions, and marriage prospects. Sometimes the standards were absurdly small. A girl who laughed too loudly. A girl seen too often with different boys. A girl who smoked openly in the wrong company. A girl who seemed too interested in politics rather than homemaking. Tiny details could be made to stand for character. This is one reason why gossip had such force. Neighborhoods, churches, schools, and extended families formed tight networks of observation. A date was rarely just between two people. It moved through social memory. Someone saw who picked you up. Someone noticed how late you came home. Someone repeated a detail, softened or sharpened by retelling. Reputation traveled faster than correction. For many young women, the fear was not dramatic scandal but quiet accumulation. Not one terrible event, but a slow collection of small impressions that changed how people looked at you. This made mothers powerful figures in the dating story. Popular memory often focuses on fathers threatening boys at the front door, but mothers frequently carried the deeper social management. They knew which families were considered respectable. They understood neighborhood judgments. They taught daughters how to dress for certain occasions, how to host, how to write thank you notes, how to survive awkward visits, how to recognize the difference between charm and instability. Sometimes this guidance was protective. Sometimes it was restrictive. Often it was both. A mother might genuinely want her daughter to be safe and happy, while also passing forward the same limitations she herself had inherited. Advice about being agreeable or marrying young was not always cruelty. It was often strategy shaped by experience. Many women who gave these lessons had learned them under harder conditions and believed they were preparing daughters for the world as it actually was, not as it should have been. The father, meanwhile, often represented approval in a different register. He might be less involved in daily emotional management but more symbolically important. A boyfriend being liked by the father could feel like a threshold crossed. Disapproval could quietly end relationships before they properly began. Religion also mattered deeply. Churches were not only spiritual institutions, they were social centers. Youth groups, dances, picnics, choirs, and Sunday gatherings created legitimate spaces for courtship. Shared faith often shaped expectations around marriage, gender roles, and sexual behavior. Marrying outside religious expectations could create family conflict strong enough to end serious relationships. A Catholic girl dating a Protestant boy, a Jewish woman facing pressure within her community, regional expectations in the South around race and religion. These were not abstract concerns. They shaped ordinary decisions about whom one could realistically love without social cost. And race, perhaps more than anything, exposed how incomplete the polished national myth really was. The cheerful universal image of 1950s dating, white dresses, convertibles, suburban dances, was never universal. In segregated America, interracial dating could provoke hostility, violence, or legal consequences depending on place and time. Entire romantic possibilities were shaped or destroyed by racial boundaries enforced both socially and institutionally. For Black women, dating existed within communities that created dignity and romance under enormous pressure, but always against the reality that the wider society was structured to limit movement, access, and safety. A date at a restaurant might not be possible in the same way. A drive through certain neighborhoods might carry danger. Public respectability was not simply etiquette. It was sometimes protection. This makes nostalgia difficult, and it should. The 1950s were not a single postcard. They were millions of private negotiations beneath one national image. Even engagement, often remembered as the happy destination, carried its own complexities. A proposal was not merely romance. It was an economic and social contract entering public view. Rings mattered because they signaled seriousness. Family approval mattered because marriage linked households, not just individuals. A woman saying yes was often saying yes not only to a man, but to a structure of life that had already been described for her in detail. Where she might live, whether she would leave paid work, how quickly children would be expected, what kind of wife she was supposed to become. Some entered that future with genuine joy. Some with hesitation they could barely admit. Some with both at once. And there were women who said no. This part is often forgotten. Not every woman followed the script obediently. Some delayed marriage. Some chose education first. Some quietly refused unsuitable men despite family pressure. Some ended engagements. Some built professional lives that did not fit the domestic ideal. Some remained unmarried and endured the social suspicion that came with it. Their existence mattered because it revealed that the system was powerful, but never total. Still, resistance had a cost. An unmarried woman in her late 20s could be spoken about with a tone of concern that sounded almost medical. Was something wrong? Was she too picky? Had she somehow failed at the central exam of womanhood? Language like old maid, even when used jokingly, carried sharp edges. It reminded women that time itself could become social judgment. This urgency shaped dating in ways modern audiences often underestimate. A disappointing date was not always just a disappointing evening. It could feel like time slipping away inside a culture that measured female success against a narrowing clock. Even joy could be pressured by deadline. This is why wedding culture became so emotionally charged. Bridal showers, engagement announcements, registry gifts, white dresses, formal photographs. These rituals were not only celebration. They were confirmation that a woman had successfully crossed into the approved adult future. Marriage was not just personal happiness. It was social legitimacy. And yet, beneath the polished wedding photographs, many women were stepping into marriages with very limited information about what married life would actually be. Sex education was often minimal or euphemistic. Financial realities could be hidden behind romance. Expectations around obedience, household labor, and motherhood might be assumed rather than discussed. A woman could spend years learning how to attract a husband and surprisingly little time being told what everyday married intimacy would demand. The preparation was often symbolic rather than practical. A girl might know how to host a dinner table beautifully and still know almost nothing about her own legal rights, reproductive health, or the emotional reality of living permanently inside another person's expectations. That gap between preparation for appearance and preparation for life may be one of the quietest truths of 1950s dating. Because the goal was not simply love. It was successful womanhood as the era defined it. And sometimes, in the stillness after the dance, after the compliments, after the ride home and the careful goodnight at the front porch, a young woman had to ask herself a far more difficult question than whether he liked her. She had to ask whether the future she was being offered was one she had truly chosen. She had to ask whether the future she was being offered was one she had truly chosen, or simply the one she had been taught to recognize as success. That question was often difficult to answer because the 1950s did not usually present alternatives with equal dignity. Marriage was visible, celebrated, and socially rewarded. Other paths existed, but they were often described as temporary, unfortunate, or incomplete. A woman who wanted something different had to imagine it against the grain of nearly everything around her. This is why so much of 1950s dating involved imagination disguised as certainty. A girl on a second or third date was not only thinking about the next weekend. She was often being asked by family, friends, and sometimes by herself to imagine 10 years ahead. Could she see herself in his house, with his habits, his family, his ambitions, his silences? Would he expect her to stop working? Would he laugh at her intelligence or quietly fear it? Would kindness during courtship survive the ordinary fatigue of marriage? These were not dramatic cinematic questions. They were practical ones. They lived in the details. How he treated waitresses, whether he listened when she spoke, whether he respected her no without making her feel guilty, whether he talked about women with contempt disguised as humor, whether he assumed her future belonged naturally inside his own plans. Sometimes the smallest observations were the clearest warnings. But the culture did not always encourage women to trust those warnings. It often encouraged adjustment instead. Perhaps he would mature. Perhaps marriage would settle him. Perhaps men were simply like that. Perhaps being too selective was its own danger. This is where dating advice could become quietly harmful. Women were often taught endurance before compatibility, patience before self-protection, grace before confrontation. They were trained to manage discomfort so smoothly that they could mistake it for normal life. And yet, many women noticed far more than the era liked to admit. Private diaries, letters, and later oral histories reveal not passive innocence but careful thought. Women discussed ambition, disappointment, attraction, boredom, class differences, and fear. They noticed when men expected service instead of partnership. They noticed when charm covered selfishness. They noticed when the dream of domestic security looked suspiciously like unpaid lifelong labor. They simply did not always have a safe language to say it aloud. This becomes especially visible in the world of engagement and premarital expectation. Once a relationship turned serious, a woman's behavior was watched differently. A fiancé was expected to transition smoothly from desirable young woman to responsible future wife. The emphasis shifted from flirtation to domestic competence. Could she host? Could she manage a home? Was she gracious with relatives? Was she the kind of woman who would make a husband look stable and successful? Marriage was personal, but it was also a public institution of respectability. Bridal magazines and advice columns reinforced this constantly. They celebrated beauty, of course, but also efficiency, thrift, emotional control, and cheerful domesticity. The ideal bride was not merely loved. She was organized. She understood linens, guest lists, kitchen appliances, and the social art of making everyone comfortable. Even romance was expected to become useful. There was a quiet irony in this. Men were often allowed to remain partially unfinished during courtship, still becoming, still building, still finding themselves. Women were expected to arrive prepared. A future husband might be praised for ambition. A future wife was praised for readiness. The emotional center of the household was supposed to be already trained before the household even existed. This training extended into education itself. High schools and colleges sometimes offered courses in home economics, etiquette, and family life that openly framed marriage as a primary destination. Learning how to cook efficiently, host politely, sew practically, and maintain domestic harmony was treated not as optional knowledge but as preparation for adulthood. The assumption beneath it was powerful. A successful woman was one who could create a successful home. This did not erase women's intellectual ambitions, but it often rearranged them. A bright student might still be encouraged to think of education as something that would make her a more interesting wife rather than an independent professional. Intelligence was welcome, but often only if it remained socially non-threatening. She could be educated but not intimidating, capable but not competitive, interesting but not difficult. Again and again, the ideal returned to balance, a balance so precise that it could become exhausting to maintain. And then there was beauty, perhaps the most visible part of the dating system and one of the least discussed honestly. The 1950s beauty standard was presented as natural femininity, but it required constant labor. Hair appointments, curling routines, stockings, ironing, posture, skin care, controlled weight, careful cosmetics. All of it demanded time, money, and discipline. Looking effortless was often a full-time side occupation. For young women, appearance was not simply vanity. It was social currency. A girl who looked polished signaled discipline, family respectability, and belonging within the culture's approved vision of womanhood. Beauty was read morally. Looking put together suggested character. Looking too careless or too obviously sexualized could create judgment. This moral reading of appearance was powerful because it made ordinary self-presentation feel like ethical performance. Even dieting entered dating culture through this logic. Magazines casually connected thinness to desirability and self-control. Women were encouraged to manage appetite as if appetite itself were suspicious. A controlled body suggested a controlled life. And yet, many of these same women were preparing family meals, baking for church events, and being praised for nourishing others while quietly learning to distrust their own hunger. The contradictions were constant. A date at a diner could involve a girl carefully deciding whether ordering dessert made her seem relaxed and charming or careless and indulgent. Small choices became symbolic because the culture insisted they were. This is one reason nostalgia can be misleading. Looking at photographs from the decade, the bright lipstick, pressed skirts, smiling couples at dances, it is easy to imagine confidence. But confidence and performance are not the same thing. Many women were learning how to look certain while carrying enormous uncertainty. The suburbs intensified some of this pressure. Post-war suburban growth created neighborhoods where family life was visible in new ways. Houses were close enough for comparison. Lawns, children, husbands' careers, dinner parties, church attendance. Everything became part of an ongoing social theater. For young women raised in these environments, dating and marriage were not abstract ideals but visible neighborhood rhythms. You could see who had married well. You could see whose daughter was still unmarried. You could see whose marriage looked polished and whose did not. This visibility made conformity easier and escape harder. At the same time, mass media helped standardize the ideal across distance. Television, Hollywood films, women's magazines, advertisements, and radio programs repeated similar stories about romance and domestic success. They did not invent expectations from nothing, but they gave them glamour and repetition. The happy couple at the center of the ad was not just selling furniture or appliances. They were selling emotional legitimacy. Buy this washing machine, this dining set, this suburban home, and you were not merely purchasing objects. You were buying evidence that your life was proceeding correctly. Dating fed directly into that promise. A good husband was imagined not only as a companion but as the key to entering that stable, admired life. This is why marriage anxiety could become so strong even for women who were not particularly romantic. It was tied to belonging, adulthood, and economic safety all at once. And beneath that polished promise sat a quieter reality: loneliness inside conformity. Some women married quickly because it was expected and later found themselves living beside men they barely knew outside courtship rituals. Dating had trained them to navigate evenings, not decades. A man who was charming in public might be emotionally distant in private. A relationship that looked ideal from the sidewalk might feel deeply lonely inside the kitchen. This is not to say 1950s marriages were uniquely unhappy. Every era has its hidden disappointments. But the cultural pressure to preserve appearances could make honest dissatisfaction feel almost unspeakable. A woman might feel grateful and trapped at once. She had the house she was told to want, the husband everyone approved of, the children, the photographs, the respectable address. And still she might quietly wonder whether desire and duty had ever been allowed to ask each other real questions. This is where dating and marriage connect most deeply. Courtship was not only about romance. It was rehearsal for a role. If a woman learned during dating to smooth conflict, protect male pride, and make emotional labor invisible, marriage often expanded those same expectations. The first date and the 10th wedding anniversary were not separate worlds. They were connected by the same cultural script. But history becomes most interesting where the script begins to crack. By the late 1950s, beneath the polished certainty of the decade, change was already gathering. Women were entering colleges in larger numbers. Workplace expectations were shifting slowly. Civil rights struggles were exposing the false universality of suburban ideals. Quiet dissatisfaction existed inside kitchens and classrooms long before it became public language in the following decade. Even dating itself was beginning to change. Some young women were asking harder questions. Did marriage have to happen so early? Could love and independence coexist? Was choosing a husband the same as choosing a life, or had those become too tightly fused? Could a woman want intimacy without surrendering ambition? These questions did not arrive suddenly in the 1960s. They were already present in late-night conversations, in letters to friends, in private doubts after engagement parties, in women watching their mothers and deciding they wanted something both similar and different. History rarely changes with a dramatic announcement. More often, it changes when ordinary people begin to feel that the official story no longer fully explains their own lives. A woman sitting on a porch after a date in 1958 might not have called herself rebellious. She might still have wanted marriage, children, and love. But if she also wanted work she cared about, respect inside marriage, or the right to delay choosing, she was already standing at the edge of a different future. And men, too, were caught inside these expectations. Many were under intense pressure to provide, lead, and perform certainty they did not always feel. Masculinity in 1950s dating was its own script. Pay, pursue, protect, decide, succeed. A failed date could feel like failed manhood. Emotional vulnerability was often poorly translated. This mattered because women were not dating a system in abstraction. They were dating men also shaped by that same culture. Sometimes kindness survived despite the script. Sometimes the script was stronger than kindness. This is why simple moral judgment does not help much. The people of the 1950s were not foolish for living inside their time. They were negotiating structures they inherited, just as people do now. The more useful question is what those structures rewarded, what they punished, and what private costs were hidden inside public ideals. Perhaps nowhere was this clearer than in the moment after a proposal. When congratulations filled the room, families smiled, rings were admired, and everyone assumed the hardest decisions had already been made. But often, that was the moment the quietest questions became loudest. Because saying yes to marriage did not answer the most private uncertainty. It only made it impossible to postpone. And in that silence between engagement and wedding, many women began to see dating differently, not as a charming sequence of dances and dinners, but as the first chapter of the life they were about to step into. Not as a charming sequence of dances and dinners, but as the first chapter of the life they were about to step into. And that realization often arrived not during romance, but during preparation. The engagement period in 1950s America was supposed to be one of happiness and forward motion. There were bridal showers, church announcements, handwritten invitations, department store registries, and careful conversations about china patterns, guest lists, and future addresses. Family members spoke with confidence, as if the path ahead had already been drawn in clean, respectable lines. But for many women, engagement was also the first time the abstract idea of marriage became solid enough to inspect. A boyfriend could remain partly imagined. A fiancé could not. Suddenly, habits mattered more than charm. His temper mattered more than his smile. His expectations about money, children, work, religion, and authority were no longer distant questions. They were furniture being moved into the next room of life. This was often the moment when a woman began to understand that courtship had been a kind of edited version of reality. A man who was generous on dates might become controlling when discussing finances. A man who admired intelligence during conversation might quietly expect obedience in domestic decisions. A man who seemed modern in public could still assume that marriage meant his wife's ambitions would naturally fold themselves around his own. The engagement period made these assumptions visible. And yet, breaking an engagement carried enormous social weight. Today, it might be framed as a difficult but practical decision. In the 1950s, it could feel like public failure. Families had been informed. Gifts had been given. The church knew. Friends knew. Neighbors knew. A woman ending an engagement was not merely changing her mind. She was disrupting a carefully staged social future. People wanted explanations. Was he unfaithful? Was she unreasonable? Had she discovered something serious? Was she afraid of commitment? Was there something wrong with her? The pressure to proceed could become stronger precisely because doubt had become visible. This meant many women entered marriage carrying uncertainty they had been trained to minimize. Not because they were naive, but because the cost of stopping could feel larger than the cost of hoping things would improve. Hope was often treated as a duty. Marriage itself was framed as a place where love would deepen naturally through shared life. If problems existed before the wedding, people often believed maturity, children, routine, or simple time would settle them. Once you're married became an answer to many unresolved concerns. Sometimes that hope was justified. Sometimes it became a very elegant way of postponing honesty. The honeymoon, too, carried its own mythology. It symbolized transition: girl to wife, courtship to permanence, romance to domestic adulthood. But beneath the symbolism was often a practical emotional shock. Many women had spent years being taught how to attract marriage and very little time being prepared for intimacy inside marriage. Conversations about sex were frequently vague, moralized, or absent altogether. A bride could arrive at her wedding night with more instruction about table settings than about her own body. This silence mattered. It shaped fear, confusion, and power inside relationships that were publicly celebrated as ideal beginnings. A woman might be expected to become emotionally and physically comfortable in a role she had barely been allowed to discuss. Again, the era prized appearance over explanation. A successful marriage was supposed to look calm. If it did not feel calm, many women assumed the problem was personal rather than structural. Perhaps they were not trying hard enough. Perhaps they were too sensitive. Perhaps every wife felt this and simply handled it better. Private unhappiness often became private guilt. And yet, many women did find genuine partnership. It is important not to flatten the decade into a single story of disappointment. Some marriages were affectionate, respectful, and deeply sustaining. Some couples built companionship that outlived the narrow gender rules around them. Some men listened, adapted, and treated wives as intellectual equals even when the culture did not teach them to do so. History is always messier than slogans. But even happy marriages existed inside a system that assumed women's labor would be quiet and constant. After marriage, dating ended in one sense and simply changed form in another. The performance of femininity did not disappear. It shifted from attracting a husband to maintaining a home, preserving marriage, and protecting family reputation. A wife was still being watched. Was the house clean? Did she entertain well? Were the children presentable? Did her husband look successful? Did she remain attractive without seeming self-absorbed? Was she cheerful enough? Grateful enough? Supportive enough? The social script continued, only now with higher stakes and fewer exits. Suburban life could intensify this. In neighborhoods built around young families, women often spent large portions of their days inside networks of observation. Coffee visits, school events, church groups, neighborhood conversations, community could be supportive, but it could also feel like a constant low-level inspection. Comparison became ordinary. One woman's new refrigerator, another woman's polished dinner parties, someone else's husband's promotion, another family's second child, someone's daughter already engaged. The ideal life was visible next door, which made private dissatisfaction harder to name. This is part of why the famous image of the smiling 1950s housewife remains so powerful and so misleading. The smile was not necessarily false. It was often real in that moment, but it existed alongside boredom, exhaustion, ambition, loneliness, and intelligence that had nowhere fully recognized to go. Dating had promised arrival. Marriage often revealed maintenance. And sometimes, unexpectedly, dating did not end with marriage at all. Affairs, flirtations, emotional attachments, and quiet private rebellions existed beneath the polished moral surface of the decade. They were not the official story, but they were part of real life. Some women found themselves drawn to attention that felt like recognition rather than romance. Some men lived double lives. Some marriages were preserved publicly and fractured privately. The strict moral language of the period did not eliminate human complexity. It simply made that complexity more secret. This is another reason nostalgia can be dangerous. It mistakes silence for simplicity. Even divorce, though far less common and far more stigmatized than today, remained part of the landscape. A divorced woman often carried social suspicion. Was she difficult, unstable, untrustworthy? Had she failed at womanhood itself? Dating after divorce could be even more complicated than dating before marriage. She was no longer a young girl moving toward approved adulthood. She was a woman whose approved story had visibly broken. And yet, for some women, divorce was not failure but clarity. Again, the official language and private reality rarely matched perfectly. Widows, too, occupied a different social space. A widow re-entering the dating world was treated differently from a divorced woman, often with more sympathy and less suspicion. But she still faced the strange challenge of beginning again in a culture that preferred women to move in one clean line. Daughter, wife, mother, respectable older woman. Any deviation required explanation. All of this reminds us that dating in the 1950s was never only youthful romance. It was a lifelong relationship with respectability. Women were not simply choosing men. They were navigating an entire moral economy built around femininity, family, and social belonging. And beneath it all sat one particularly powerful fear: being alone. Not loneliness in the emotional sense, though that mattered too. Social aloneness, economic aloneness, cultural aloneness. A woman without marriage often lacked not only companionship but legitimacy in the eyes of the culture. She might have less financial security, less social approval, fewer acceptable life scripts, and a constant low background noise of questions from others. Why aren't you married? Don't you want children? Haven't you found the right man yet? The questions were often framed as concern, but concern can be its own form of discipline. This is why marriage decisions could not be understood purely through romance. Love mattered, but security mattered too. Respectability mattered. Escape from judgment mattered. Stability mattered. A woman might marry partly for affection, partly for survival, and partly because the culture had made unmarried adulthood feel like standing permanently outside the house looking in. Seen from that angle, many dating choices become less mysterious. The girl who accepted a proposal she felt uncertain about. The woman who stayed with a difficult man because leaving felt impossible. The college student who abandoned professional plans for a safer future. The young wife who smiled at the dinner party and cried quietly later. These are not contradictions. They are the ordinary negotiations of a world with narrow doors. And still, beneath all of it, there were women asking larger questions. Some asked them softly, some only to close friends, some only to themselves. What if companionship mattered more than status? What if marriage should be delayed rather than rushed? What if a woman could be complete without becoming someone's wife? What if love required equality, not simply approval? These questions were not yet the public language of a movement, but they were present. History often begins there, in private thought before public change. A woman reading a magazine article about domestic happiness might feel not rebellion, but a faint mismatch. Something about the promise did not entirely fit her own life. She might not reject marriage. She might still want it deeply, but she also wanted to be seen as more than preparation for someone else's future. That quiet mismatch mattered. It accumulated across millions of kitchens, dorm rooms, bus rides, office desks, and late-night conversations. It lived in women watching older sisters marry, in daughters observing mothers, in wives comparing the public story of happiness to the private work required to sustain it. The 1950s looked stable because so much effort was spent maintaining the appearance of stability. Dating, in that sense, was not separate from the decade's larger anxieties. It was one of the places where those anxieties became personal. The Cold War, suburban expansion, consumer optimism, racial segregation, religious morality, gender expectation, all of it entered the front seat of the car on a Saturday night. A boy asking a girl to the movies was never just a boy asking a girl to the movies. It was a small act carrying the weight of an era. And perhaps nowhere was that weight felt more clearly than in the rituals everyone treated as harmless. The dance, the ring, the ride home, the waiting by the telephone, the carefully timed goodnight kiss, the question of whether he would call again. Because inside those ordinary rituals, women were learning what the culture believed they were worth. And once they learned that lesson, the next challenge was deciding whether to believe it. Because the official lesson of 1950s dating was clear enough. A woman's value was closely tied to being chosen. Chosen for the dance, chosen for the date, chosen for the engagement, chosen for the marriage. Attention itself could feel like proof of worth, and the absence of it could feel like a quiet accusation. This made rejection heavier than simple disappointment. A boy not calling back was rarely interpreted as one ordinary mismatch. It could become a question about the self. Was she too quiet? Too serious? Not pretty enough? Too ambitious? Too available? Not available enough? The dating culture trained women to translate romantic uncertainty into personal evaluation. And because so much of that evaluation happened in public, privacy was difficult to protect. A young woman might return from a disappointing date and immediately enter a second performance. Answering questions from family, explaining details to friends, pretending indifference if she felt hurt. Even heartbreak had etiquette. She was expected to remain graceful, not dramatic. To be desirable meant appearing emotionally balanced, even when she was not. This emotional discipline was so normalized that many women barely recognized it as work. To wait calmly by the phone, to smile politely after rejection, to continue attending social events where an ex-boyfriend might appear with someone else, to accept that a man could change his mind while she was expected to preserve dignity. These were ordinary acts, but they required strength. There is something revealing in how often 1950s advice described confidence as attractiveness while offering women very few stable places from which confidence could grow. Confidence was supposed to come from being admired, but admiration itself was conditional and unstable. It depended on youth, appearance, charm, timing, and luck. For many women, confidence became performance rather than foundation. This was especially visible in the culture of popularity. In high school and college, social visibility could shape identity with surprising force. Being invited to the right parties, having a steady boyfriend, being seen at the right restaurants or football games. These things could determine whether a girl felt securely inside the world or painfully outside it. Popularity was often presented as natural, but it was carefully maintained. Girls studied one another constantly. Hairstyles, shoes, speech patterns, the right lipstick shade, how loudly someone laughed, who sat with whom at lunch, who was invited where. Small social codes created entire emotional climates. The irony was that many of these girls were equally uncertain, all trying to look like they belonged. A quiet kind of theater. And beneath that theater was class. Middle-class suburban dating became the dominant national image partly because it was the image most widely sold in media. But class shaped romance at every level. A girl whose father worked in an office and lived in a growing suburb moved through different expectations than a girl whose family rented a small apartment above a store, or whose parents depended on seasonal work, or whose future felt economically urgent rather than romantically planned. Working-class women often had less room for delay. Marriage might come earlier not because of stronger romance, but because independence was harder to afford. A job might be necessary, but so was practical security. Dating could feel less like a long exploration and more like a decision made under economic weather. And money shaped men differently too. A young man without clear prospects might still be kind, intelligent, and loved. But in the logic of the era, financial uncertainty could make him seem unsuitable. Women were often judged for marrying well, which meant affection and calculation were rarely fully separate. Love and economics sat at the same dinner table. This was not cynicism. It was realism inside a system where a husband's income often determined the architecture of a woman's life. Would there be a house? Children soon? A car? Safety from financial humiliation? The ability to leave unpleasant work? Respect from relatives? Marriage was romance tied directly to survival. That reality could create a strange moral confusion. A woman might genuinely love one man and marry another who looked safer. She might choose stability and later wonder about desire. Or she might choose love and spend years paying for it economically. Neither choice was simple. The same complexity existed around education. College dating often carried an atmosphere of urgency, hidden beneath football weekends and formal dances. Women were encouraged to be educated, but frequently with the assumption that education should complement marriage, not compete with it. A woman too committed to professional ambition risked being seen as threatening, but a woman with no visible intelligence risked seeming dull. Again, balance. A woman might study literature, chemistry, or law and still hear relatives speak of college mainly as the place where she would meet the right kind of husband. Her diploma and her dating life could be discussed in the same breath, but not with equal seriousness. Some women accepted this. Some resisted quietly. Some did both at once. The same woman might want intellectual work and also want marriage deeply. History becomes inaccurate when it assumes women had to be either obedient or rebellious. Most were simply trying to build livable lives inside limited options. And then there were the rituals of public romance, the places where the private relationship became a social object. Proms, engagement parties, holiday dinners, church announcements, wedding showers, these were not only celebrations. They were forms of public verification. Other people were asked to witness that your relationship was legitimate, respectable, and moving correctly through time. This is why public embarrassment carried such power. A broken engagement was not just emotional pain. It was a social rupture. A boyfriend failing to appear for an important event could feel humiliating because others had seen the absence. A woman whose relationship stalled without formal progress might feel trapped in a kind of visible waiting. Time itself became public. How long have they been dating? Why hasn't he proposed? Do you think she scared him off? Maybe she waited too long. The language was casual, but the consequences were not. Even the symbol of the ring reveals something important. Engagement rings were romantic, yes, but also social proof. They signaled seriousness in a world where women's sexual respectability and future security were tightly linked. A ring said this relationship had direction. It made a promise visible enough for others to trust. Without that visibility, uncertainty could feel dangerous. This is one reason going steady mattered so much for younger women. A class ring, a jacket, a visible sign of attachment. It marked territory in a social landscape where being unattached could invite pity or unwanted judgment. Yet attachment also created dependence. A girl going steady might begin shaping her choices around one boy's plans long before marriage officially existed. She might choose a college nearby, delay other opportunities, or quietly reorganize her future around someone whose certainty she could not fully guarantee. Sometimes that trust was rewarded. Sometimes it became the first sacrifice. This is where memory becomes especially selective. Older generations sometimes remember the rituals with warmth, the dances, the music, the formal manners, the sense that romance had clearer steps. And those memories are real. There was beauty in ritual. There was pleasure in anticipation. There was dignity in certain forms of attention that later decades sometimes treated more casually. But clarity of ritual did not always mean clarity of freedom. Sometimes the script was comforting because everyone knew their lines. Sometimes it was suffocating for exactly the same reason. A woman could feel both truths at once. She might love the flowers, the music, the handwritten letters, the careful dress for Friday night, and still feel the weight of being measured constantly. She might want marriage and still resent how little space existed to imagine herself outside it. This complexity is what makes the history human. The 1950s were not populated by symbols. They were populated by people trying to live inside expectations that often felt natural because they were everywhere. A mother giving advice about dating might sincerely believe she was protecting her daughter from pain because that advice had once protected her. A father insisting on respectability might be trying to secure a future he himself had struggled to build. A young man performing confidence on a date might be terrified of failing as a provider before he had even begun adult life. Everyone was carrying a script, even when they thought they were simply being themselves. And this becomes especially clear when we look at the places where the script broke. When a woman refused a proposal, when she stayed single longer than expected, when she chose work over immediate marriage, when she dated someone her family disapproved of, when she admitted unhappiness after marriage instead of hiding it. Those moments often created shock because they revealed how much the culture depended on quiet agreement. Refusal could be treated almost like rebellion. Imagine a woman in 1957, sitting at a kitchen table after telling a perfectly respectable man no. He is kind enough. He has prospects. Her mother thinks he is sensible. Her friends assume she should feel lucky. There is no dramatic villain. Only a feeling she cannot dismiss, that marrying him would mean disappearing slightly inside a life that looked correct from the outside. How does she explain that? There was rarely good language for it. To say, "I want more," could sound selfish. To say, "I am not sure," could sound immature. To say, "I want a different life," could sound like betrayal of everything she had been taught to admire. So many women translated these feelings into silence. But silence does not erase thought. It stores it. And across the decade, those stored thoughts accumulated. In college dormitories, women whispered about professors who treated them more seriously than their fiancés did. In offices, secretaries watched male colleagues rise faster while being told marriage would make career concerns irrelevant. In suburbs, wives compared the promise of domestic fulfillment with the repetitive isolation of their afternoons. In churches, women balanced genuine faith with frustration at how moral authority was distributed. Dating sat at the center of all of it because dating was where the future first became negotiable. Who you dated shaped who you might marry. Who you married shaped nearly everything else. So the first date mattered, but not always for the reasons people imagined. It mattered not because of romance alone, but because it was the beginning of a long negotiation between personal desire and public expectation. A milkshake at a diner, a ride home after the movies, a nervous conversation on the porch. A ring slipped onto a finger. These were small scenes carrying enormous historical weight. And perhaps the most revealing part is this. Many women understood that weight perfectly well, even when the culture preferred to imagine them as simply waiting to be chosen. They were not only waiting, they were watching, comparing, calculating, hoping, enduring, and sometimes very quietly rewriting the terms for themselves. Because once a woman began to question whether being chosen was the same as being fulfilled, the entire architecture of 1950s dating started to look less like destiny, and more like a system that could eventually be changed. Because once a woman began to question whether being chosen was the same as being fulfilled, the entire architecture of 1950s dating started to look less like destiny, and more like a system that could eventually be changed. But change rarely begins with grand declarations. More often, it begins with ordinary disappointments repeated often enough that they stop feeling personal and start feeling structural. A woman notices that every conversation about her future eventually narrows to marriage, no matter how talented she is elsewhere. Another notices that the men praised as good catches are often simply men with stable incomes, regardless of kindness. Another realizes that dating requires her to perform gratitude for attention she does not even want. Another marries young, as expected, and discovers that loneliness can exist inside a full dining room. At first, each experience feels private. She assumes perhaps she alone feels restless. Perhaps she alone is ungrateful. Perhaps she alone is too ambitious, too difficult, too unwilling to be satisfied. But history shifts when private discomfort becomes shared recognition. And in the late 1950s, that recognition was beginning to travel quietly between women. Sometimes it moved through friendship. A late-night conversation after a party. Two roommates talking honestly once the careful smiles of the evening were gone. A sister admitting she was not as happy in marriage as everyone assumed. A mother, unexpectedly honest, confessing that love and duty were never as neatly aligned as magazines promised. Sometimes it moved through books and articles. Advice columns meant to reassure could accidentally reveal how widespread the same frustrations were. Letters from readers often exposed the gap between public ideals and lived reality. Women wrote in asking how to feel less guilty for wanting work, less ashamed for delaying marriage, less frightened of disappointing parents, less alone in marriages that looked successful from the outside. The very act of asking those questions mattered, because 1950s dating culture often treated uncertainty as a personal flaw rather than evidence that the system itself asked too much. If a woman felt trapped, she was encouraged to adjust herself rather than question the structure. But not everyone accepted that quietly. There were women who dated with far more independence than the official story allowed. Some refused to settle for men who expected obedience disguised as love. Some chose cities over suburbs, apartments over early marriage, work over immediate domesticity. Some postponed engagement not because they feared commitment, but because they wanted to understand themselves before promising permanence to someone else. This could look radical even when it was simply thoughtful. And sometimes the most radical act was not leaving the system, but negotiating it differently. A woman might marry and still insist on continuing her education. She might choose children later rather than immediately. She might quietly manage family finances rather than accepting total dependence. She might reject the expectation that her husband's career naturally outranked her own mind. These were not always dramatic rebellions. Often they were small acts of authorship. The official image of the decade leaves little room for this subtle negotiation because it prefers clear categories: obedient wives or rebellious women, happy homemakers or frustrated moderns. Real lives were much less tidy. Many women loved domestic life and still wanted intellectual seriousness. Many wanted marriage and also wanted autonomy. Many deeply valued family while resenting the assumption that family erased every other part of the self. Contradiction was not failure. It was ordinary adulthood. Dating, then, was often the first place where these contradictions had to be managed. Consider the question of conversation itself. A date was supposed to feel light, easy, and charming. Yet beneath that surface were difficult calculations about how much of the self could be shown safely. Could a woman speak openly about ambition without seeming unfeminine? Could she admit political opinions without seeming threatening? Could she disagree without appearing difficult? Could she be intelligent without being accused of making a man feel small? This made conversation a kind of editing process. Many women learned to reveal themselves in carefully measured portions. Enough intelligence to be interesting. Enough softness to remain acceptable. Enough mystery to invite pursuit. Enough restraint to avoid punishment. This was not manipulation so much as adaptation. And men were adapting too, though differently. They were expected to perform competence, direction, and economic promise, often before they fully possessed any of them. A young man on a date might be judged not only as a companion but as a future provider. His car, job prospects, confidence, and decisiveness all became evidence of masculine worth. This pressure could make tenderness difficult. A man taught that love must be proven through provision might struggle to offer emotional openness. A woman taught that safety depended on male stability might mistake emotional distance for maturity. Two people could genuinely care for one another while still speaking through scripts they had inherited rather than chosen. This is one reason the era's romances could feel both deeply sincere and strangely constrained. People were often trying to love each other through the language available to them. And sometimes that language failed. A woman might want reassurance and receive practical advice instead. A man might want admiration and receive careful politeness. Both might believe they were doing love correctly while feeling unseen. This gap between performance and intimacy shaped not only marriages, but the dates that came before them. Take something as simple as the goodnight kiss. Popular memory treats it as charming, almost innocent. A soft moment at the front porch under a porch light, the car cooling in the driveway, the house dark except for one waiting parent behind a curtain. But even this small ritual carried enormous social meaning. How long should she stand there? Should she invite another date or wait for him to ask? Would refusing a kiss seem cold? Would accepting too easily seem careless? Did the kiss mean seriousness? Or was it merely habit? The smallest moment could require strategic reading. And afterward came analysis. Friends would ask. Sisters would ask. Sometimes mothers would ask without asking directly. Did he kiss you? How did he say goodnight? Do you think he'll call? Romance became communal interpretation. There was very little space for simply not knowing. Ambiguity itself could feel like a problem to be solved. The same was true with letters and phone calls. The timing mattered. Too quick could seem overeager. Too slow could suggest indifference. Silence stretched loudly. Waiting for the phone to ring became its own emotional occupation. Because communication was slower, uncertainty had time to grow. Today, a message can arrive in seconds. In the 1950s, absence could last days with no explanation. A woman might replay an evening repeatedly, trying to understand whether she had said too much, too little, laughed at the wrong moment, worn the wrong dress, trusted the wrong signal. Sometimes the answer was simple. He was distracted, uncertain, immature, or simply not interested. But the culture encouraged women to search themselves first. This is why so much emotional energy in 1950s dating was invisible. It lived in interpretation, anticipation, self-correction, and the management of hope. Hope itself could be exhausting. To date seriously was to live with suspended possibility. Every promising relationship carried not only affection, but the question of whether it would become permanent. Women were encouraged to treat permanence as the real measure of success, which meant even happy romance could be shadowed by evaluation. Is this going somewhere? That question followed countless ordinary evenings. And because marriage was treated as the proper destination, relationships that ended could feel like wasted time rather than meaningful experience. A woman might genuinely care for someone and still feel pressure to judge the relationship by whether it produced a proposal. This narrowed the emotional vocabulary of love. Not every important relationship leads to marriage, but the culture often treated non-marital endings as failures rather than chapters of becoming. Women were asked not simply whom they loved, but whether that love advanced them toward legitimacy. The question was never neutral. This also shaped how women viewed one another. Female friendship could be intimate and sustaining, yet it was often treated as secondary to romance. Friends were expected to celebrate engagements, weddings, pregnancies, the milestones of heterosexual domestic success, as the natural center of adulthood. And yet, many women found their deepest honesty not in romance, but in friendship. It was often with female friends that they admitted fear, boredom, desire, resentment, or doubt. A best friend might understand a woman's real life more clearly than the man she was preparing to marry. Friendship became a quiet parallel world, less publicly celebrated, but often emotionally essential. This matters because dating history is often told as if women existed only in relation to men. In truth, they were interpreting those relationships constantly through conversations with other women. A roommate saying, "You don't seem happy." A sister asking, "Is this really what you want?" A friend confessing, "I thought I was the only one." Sometimes those sentences changed lives. Sometimes they were the first permission a woman received to trust her own discomfort. And still, the pressure of the larger world remained strong. Respectability was persuasive because it offered real rewards: safety, belonging, admiration, predictability. To reject it entirely could mean loneliness, financial vulnerability, family disappointment, and social suspicion. This is why even women who questioned the system often moved carefully rather than dramatically. Revolution in real life is often a woman saying she wants to wait one more year before marriage, or keeping her own bank account, or choosing graduate school, or leaving a fiancé everyone else approves of, or insisting that love without respect is not enough. Small decisions can carry historical force when the culture expects automatic obedience. By the end of the decade, these private negotiations were accumulating into something larger. The polished certainty of 1950s romance had not disappeared, but its edges were beginning to show. Beneath the perfect wedding photographs and cheerful advertisements, many women were no longer fully convinced that being admired was the same as being understood. That distinction would matter enormously, because once a woman wanted not only affection, but recognition. Recognition of her mind, her labor, her ambition, her boredom, her intelligence, her full personhood. The old dating script began to feel strangely thin. Flowers were still lovely. A ring could still mean love. Marriage could still be joyful, but none of those things were enough if they required a smaller self in exchange. That realization did not arrive all at once. Came slowly, often disguised as restlessness. A feeling that something was missing even when nothing appeared wrong. A sense that the future being praised for you was not quite the same as the future you would choose for yourself if no one were watching. And perhaps that was the most revolutionary question a woman in 1959 could ask after a perfectly respectable date. Not, "Does he like me?" but "Who do I become if I say yes?" But "Who do I become if I say yes?" was not a question the 1950s easily welcomed. It was too inward, too uncertain, too resistant to the neat public language of romance. The decade preferred visible milestones: engagements, weddings, anniversaries, babies, houses, polished Christmas cards. These could be photographed, admired, and understood by everyone. Inner questions could not. And yet, private life is where history often matters most. A woman standing in her kitchen after guests had gone home, looking at dishes in the sink and a husband reading the evening paper, might feel something she could not name without sounding ungrateful. Not misery, necessarily, not regret in a dramatic sense, but a quiet awareness that she had become highly skilled at maintaining a life and less certain about whether that life fully belonged to her. This feeling would later be discussed much more openly, but in the late 1950s it often existed without clean language. She might describe it as tiredness, as nerves, as selfishness, as just a phase. The culture had many names for female dissatisfaction, but very few that treated it as serious thought. Dating mattered here because it was often the first place that pattern began. A woman learned early that discomfort could be reframed as personal failure. If a date felt wrong, perhaps she was too picky. If a fiancé felt controlling, perhaps she needed to be more understanding. If marriage felt lonely, perhaps she was expecting too much. The system protected itself by teaching women to interpret structural tension as individual weakness. This is why the idea of having standards could be surprisingly controversial. A woman who clearly knew what she wanted risked being described as difficult. Standards were praised in theory. Of course she should choose a good man. But in practice they were expected to remain soft enough not to disrupt the social flow toward marriage. Too much selectiveness threatened the timeline. People worried. She's not getting any younger. She'll scare men away. No one is perfect. Marriage requires compromise. All true in part, and yet often used to push women past instincts that deserved attention. There is a quiet bravery in saying no when everyone around you insists yes would be easier, especially because women were often trained to protect harmony before truth. To refuse a proposal, to delay a wedding, to remain single by choice. These were not simply personal acts. They disturbed the emotional economy of families. Parents worried. Friends took sides. Mothers heard echoes of their own choices. Fathers wondered whether independence would become vulnerability. Even love could become pressure. A mother might urge marriage because she wanted security for her daughter, not because she lacked imagination. A father might prefer a stable husband over uncertain ambition because he understood how fragile economic safety could be. These were not always villains enforcing tradition. Often they were people shaped by harder histories, trying to protect the next generation using the only map they trusted. But inherited protection can still become inherited confinement. This is part of what makes 1950s dating so emotionally complex. Almost everyone believed they were acting reasonably. The girl wanting more freedom, the mother wanting stability, the boyfriend expecting familiar roles, the father asking practical questions, the community rewarding predictability. No one needed to be cruel for the structure to feel restrictive. And then there was the simple matter of desire itself, what women actually wanted, rather than what they were supposed to want. Desire is often flattened in historical memory. The stereotype suggests that women of the 1950s passively waited for romance to arrive, modest and grateful. Real women were far more complicated. They desired attraction, excitement, pleasure, admiration, adventure, intellectual connection, emotional safety, and sometimes escape. They were not blank spaces waiting to be selected. But the acceptable language for female desire was narrow. A woman could want love. She could want marriage. She could want to be admired. But desire that looked too direct, sexual desire, ambition, hunger for independence, refusal of domestic inevitability, was often treated as dangerous or improper. This forced desire into coded forms. A woman might talk about wanting a different kind of life when she meant freedom. She might describe herself as not ready when she meant she could not imagine disappearing into the role being offered. She might pursue education because it gave her socially acceptable time to delay choices she was not ready to make. Delay itself could be a form of resistance. College, work, city life, travel, even prolonged engagement. These sometimes function not only as life stages but as breathing room. Time to postpone becoming final. Because marriage in that world often felt final. Today, relationships are frequently imagined as revisable. In the 1950s, marriage carried a heavier sense of permanence, not only emotionally but socially and legally. Divorce existed, but with significant stigma and practical difficulty. To choose wrongly could shape decades. This made caution rational. It also made romance heavier than romance was allowed to look. A first date might seem casual to outsiders, but to the woman living inside that culture, it sat within a chain of expectations extending years into the future. The man across the table was not just a companion for tonight. He was potentially a husband, a father of future children, a financial partner, a social identity, an entire architecture of ordinary mornings. No wonder dates could feel exhausting, and yet people still fell in love. They laughed in diners. They danced badly at school functions. They sat too long in parked cars talking about impossible futures. They wrote letters that mattered more than they admitted. They watched each other across church halls and office rooms and train platforms and felt the ordinary human shock of wanting one particular person. The emotional truth of romance should not be lost inside structural analysis. Love was real. So was tenderness. So was joy. The problem was never that romance was false. It was that romance was expected to carry too many other responsibilities at once. It had to be love and security and respectability and adulthood and financial planning and moral approval all together. A marriage proposal was not only, "I love you." It was also, "Can we build a respectable life? Will our families approve? Can I provide? Will you leave your own plans? Can we perform the future correctly?" That is a great deal to hide inside a ring box. And because so much depended on the answer, many women became highly skilled readers of character. Long before the language of red flags existed, women were noticing patterns. How did he behave when disappointed? Did he mock other women casually? Did he assume her work mattered less? Was he kind only when admired? Did he listen to waitstaff? Did he respect boundaries without sulking? Did he speak of marriage as partnership or ownership? These observations mattered more than the flowers. Often, older women passed this knowledge quietly, not in official advice books, but in remarks made while folding laundry, preparing dinner, or walking home after church. Watch how he treats people who cannot help him. Pay attention when he is angry. Charm is not the same as reliability. A man who embarrasses you before marriage will not become gentler after. These were hard-earned sentences. Sometimes they were the truest education available. There is something moving in the way women taught each other survival beneath the polished rituals. Official culture sold fantasy. Private female networks often supplied realism. And still, realism did not remove hope. Many women genuinely believed they could build marriages better than the ones they had observed. They wanted companionship, not merely duty. They wanted husbands who would talk to them, not simply provide for them. They wanted homes that felt alive rather than staged. In small ways, expectations were already shifting. A woman might still want marriage deeply but also want laughter inside it. She might want children but not immediate disappearance into motherhood. She might want domestic life without surrendering intellectual life. She might want to be loved not for how well she performed femininity, but for the person underneath it. This desire for recognition, real recognition, was perhaps the quiet revolution already underway. Because once a woman expected to be seen as a full person, dating changed shape. The right man was no longer simply the man who proposed respectably. He was the man with whom she could remain fully visible. That standard was harder to satisfy. It made some women lonelier for a time, because refusing the easy script can create empty space before something better appears. But it also made relationships more honest. The 1950s often praised certainty. Yet many of the wisest choices came from uncertainty taken seriously. "I'm not sure" can be a profound historical sentence. Can stop a wedding, delay a move, protect a future self no one else is defending. And often, the people most threatened by that uncertainty were not enemies, but people invested in stability. Families wanted reassurance. Communities wanted continuity. Institutions, schools, churches, workplaces functioned more smoothly when women accepted predictable roles. A woman asking difficult questions disrupted more than her own plans. She exposed the fact that the system required consent to feel natural. That is why even small acts of independence could seem strangely dramatic. Taking a job in another city, living alone, remaining unmarried past a certain age, saying no to a respectable proposal. keeping one's own ambitions visible after engagement. These acts challenged not only expectation, but imagination. They forced others to consider that there might be more than one legitimate way to become an adult woman. And once that possibility existed, it was difficult to make it disappear again. Even women who chose traditional marriages were changed by knowing there had been a choice. Choice alters obedience. A wife who married because she wanted that life is living a different history from a wife who married because no other life seems socially survivable, even if their kitchens looked identical from the street. This is why understanding 1950s dating requires more than looking at dresses, dances, and old photographs. It requires listening for the invisible negotiations underneath them, the smile in the prom picture, the hesitation before saying yes, the late-night talk with a friend, the mother's warning disguised as casual advice, the long pause before answering a proposal, the private relief after ending an engagement everyone else thought was perfect. History lives there, not only in the wedding but in the doubt before it. And by the end of the decade, more women were beginning to trust that doubt, not as failure but as information. They were starting to understand that love without respect could become loneliness, that security without selfhood could become another kind of risk, and that being admired for fitting the role was not always the same as being loved for being real. Once that understanding arrived, even the most ordinary date, a dinner, a movie, a quiet drive home, could carry a new question beneath the old rituals. Not simply, will he ask again? But, if he does, what kind of life am I being asked to enter? But, if he does, what kind of life am I being asked to enter? That question could make an ordinary evening feel unexpectedly serious. A woman might be sitting across from a man at a restaurant, listening to him talk about work, family, or where he imagined himself in 10 years, and hearing far more than the surface of the conversation. She was listening for shape, for the architecture of a future hidden inside casual remarks. Did he say we naturally, or did every plan assume she would simply fit herself around him? Did he speak about women with respect, or only approval when they made life easier for men? Did he imagine a wife as a companion, or as evidence that adulthood had been successfully achieved? These were not dramatic revelations. Often they appeared in the smallest assumptions. A joke about how wives always complain, a certainty that she would eventually stop working, an easy expectation that her ambitions were flexible while his were fixed. Sometimes love did not end because affection disappeared. It ended because clarity arrived. And clarity could be strangely quiet. There was no argument, no betrayal, no scandal, only the slow recognition that a person could be kind and still be wrong for the life she wanted. That realization could be difficult to defend because it sounded so intangible. How do you explain to your parents that the problem is not cruelty, but absence? Not obvious unhappiness, but the sense that your future self would slowly become smaller? The 1950s did not always honor that kind of reasoning. Practical people would say he's a good man. Friends would say you're lucky. Relatives would remind you how many women would gladly trade places. And perhaps all of that was true. But women were learning that gratitude and compatibility were not the same thing. This was one of the deeper shifts happening beneath the decade's polished surface. Marriage was still expected, still desired, still central, but the definition of what counted as a good marriage was beginning to change. Security alone was no longer enough for everyone. Previous generations, especially those shaped by depression, war, and economic instability, often placed enormous moral value on stability. A husband who worked steadily, paid bills, remained respectable, and avoided obvious disaster could genuinely represent success. Emotional fulfillment might be hoped for, but survival had taught people not to dismiss security lightly. The daughters of the 1950s inherited that wisdom, but they also inherited a different world, more education, expanding suburbs, consumer abundance, new forms of leisure, and a growing sense that life might contain choices beyond endurance. They were not ungrateful. They were historically positioned differently. This created tension between generations. A mother who had married for stability might struggle to understand a daughter refusing a safe future for reasons that sounded emotional or abstract. "He's reliable" could feel like the strongest possible argument to one woman and an incomplete answer to another. Neither was foolish. They were standing on different definitions of risk. To the mother, refusing security looked dangerous. To the daughter, accepting security without recognition could look like another kind of danger. Dating was where those definitions collided most clearly. It was also where class aspiration often revealed itself most sharply. The post-war dream of upward mobility shaped romantic decisions constantly. Marriage could change class position. A woman marrying into professional stability entered not only a relationship, but often a neighborhood, a school district, a social network, a standard of living, and a version of adulthood that carried visible prestige. This did not mean women were calculating in a cold sense. It meant they understood consequences. A husband's profession mattered because it shaped daily life. An address mattered because it shaped children's futures. A family name mattered because it opened or closed doors. Love was rarely asked to stand alone. And because marriage carried this much structural importance, dating often became a stage where women were subtly evaluated not just as romantic partners, but as future social representatives. Would she embarrass him at business dinners? Could she host properly? Would she fit among his colleagues' wives? Did she come from the right kind of family? Was she polished enough to reflect well on his ambitions? Respectability worked both ways. A woman was choosing a man, but she was also being assessed as part of his future presentation to the world. Her femininity was not private. It was social capital. This helps explain why etiquette felt so loaded. Table manners, thank you notes, introductions, posture, dress codes, knowing when to speak and when not to, these were not trivial refinements. They were part of proving one belonged inside a certain class performance. A date at a restaurant was sometimes less about dinner than about demonstrating fluency in the rituals of adulthood. The pressure could be exhausting precisely because it hid itself under the language of natural grace. She was not supposed to look trained. She was supposed to look effortlessly suitable. And of course, race determined who was even allowed access to these rituals. The dominant American story of 1950s romance was built around white suburban respectability, but millions of women lived outside that protected image. Black women, Latino women, Asian American women, Native women, all navigated gender expectations inside racialized systems that made dating, marriage, and respectability differently dangerous and differently constrained. For Black women in particular, respectability politics often carried heavy protective force. Appearance, manners, education, and reputation could be used strategically against a society already prepared to stereotype and diminish. Dating was never separate from racial dignity. At the same time, segregation limited where romance could even unfold. Restaurants, theaters, neighborhoods, schools, and public spaces shaped intimacy. The freedom suggested by popular American romance culture was never equally distributed. This matters because nostalgia often remembers the privileges of one group as if they were national reality. Even within white middle-class life, religion could redraw the map of possibility. A Protestant girl and a Catholic boy, a Jewish woman navigating family expectations, regional Southern Protestant codes around courtship and marriage. Romantic compatibility was often filtered through spiritual community long before personal compatibility had time to grow. Love had to survive institutions. A relationship that felt emotionally simple between two people could become socially complicated the moment families entered the room. Conversion, children, holiday traditions, funeral expectations, inherited loyalties. Religion was not background decoration. It was structure. And again, women were often expected to do the emotional bridging. They would adapt. They would host both families. They would preserve harmony. They would translate conflict into politeness. This expectation of emotional management followed women everywhere. Dating trained it. Marriage institutionalized it. A woman learned how to make everyone comfortable so early that she might not notice how rarely comfort moved in her direction. She noticed everyone's preferences, remembered everyone's birthdays, protected male pride, softened awkwardness, absorbed tension before it became visible. And because she did it well, it was often treated as personality rather than labor. This invisible work is one of the least photographed parts of 1950s romance. You can see the engagement ring in the picture. You cannot see the emotional calculations that made the evening possible. You can see the wedding cake. You cannot see the conversations she avoided so no one would feel embarrassed. You can see the smiling couple. You cannot see how much of her intelligence was being translated into pleasantness so the relationship would remain stable. Yet that invisible work shaped entire lives. Many women became experts at making domestic peace, but expertise is not the same as freedom. Sometimes peace was genuine partnership. Sometimes it was silence arranged so beautifully it looked like harmony. This is where female friendship became not just comfort, but truth-telling. A friend might be the one person allowed to say, "You are not imagining this." She might be the first person to ask whether a relationship actually felt safe. She might be the only witness to the version of a woman that existed before marriage made everyone call her someone's wife. Friendship preserved memory. It reminded women they had selves that predated courtship, and that mattered more than history often admits. Because one of the quietest fears in 1950s dating was not simply choosing the wrong man. It was losing the version of yourself that existed before choosing at all. The girl who loved books before anyone asked if they would interfere with homemaking. The student who wanted graduate school before engagement rearranged geography. The young woman who laughed loudly before elegance became discipline. The office worker who liked earning her own money before dependence was renamed romance. Dating could feel like movement toward adulthood, but sometimes it also felt like gradual negotiation over which parts of the self were allowed to remain. This is why some women remembered courtship with sweetness and others with fatigue, and many with both at once. They remembered flowers and pressure, music and scrutiny, desire and caution, hope and calculation. The contradiction was the reality. And by the end of the decade, contradiction itself was becoming harder to ignore. A woman could look around and see that the perfect model did not always produce perfect lives. Respectable marriages still contained loneliness. Beautiful homes still contained resentment. Popular girls still married badly. Quiet girls sometimes built happier lives by refusing the expected script. Evidence was everywhere if one allowed oneself to see it. This did not destroy the dream of marriage. Complicated it. Women were not necessarily abandoning romance. They were asking for more from it. Not simply admiration, but respect. Not simply provision, but partnership. Not simply being chosen, but being known. That distinction sounds small, but historically it was enormous. Because once women began to treat emotional equality as part of romantic legitimacy, the entire foundation of traditional dating rituals shifted. A proposal was no longer enough if it came attached to unquestioned hierarchy. A stable life was not automatically a good life if it required permanent self-erasure. The old script still existed, but it no longer felt inevitable. And when inevitability weakens, choice becomes visible. A woman saying yes to marriage could mean joy. A woman saying no could mean wisdom. A woman waiting could mean courage. The same action no longer carried only one moral meaning. This was the beginning of a very different conversation about love, one that would become louder in the next decade, but was already alive in the quiet decisions of late 1950s women sitting in parked cars, at office desks, in dormitory rooms, at kitchen tables, and on front porches after dates that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Because the porch light might be soft, the night air calm, the goodbye polite, but inside her mind the question had become far more serious than whether the evening had gone well. She was beginning to ask whether the life being offered in romance was large enough to hold the person she was becoming. And in the end, that may be the truest way to understand what dating was really like for women in 1950s America. It was never just about lipstick, dances, milkshakes, or the boy arriving at the front door in a polished car. It was never only the jukebox song, the corsage, the movie theater, the careful goodnight kiss beneath the porch light. Those things were real, and for many people they were genuinely beautiful. They deserved to be remembered. But beneath that polished surface, dating was also a system of judgment, expectation, negotiation, and quiet emotional labor. A woman was not simply asking whether she liked someone. She was asking whether she could trust him with the shape of her future. She was measuring not only charm but safety, not only attraction but respect, not only romance but whether marriage would make her life larger or smaller. She was learning how much of herself the world expected her to trade for approval. And often, she was doing all of this while smiling, while appearing effortless, while everyone around her called it simply dating. That is why nostalgia can be both comforting and incomplete. Yes, there was elegance in ritual. There was beauty in handwritten letters, in formal dances, in the seriousness with which romance was often treated. There was tenderness in many of those lives, and many marriages built in that era were loving, loyal, and deeply meaningful. But there was also silence. There was pressure. There were rules that asked women to become pleasing before becoming fully known. And for many women, the most important part of the story was not the date itself, but the private thought that followed it. The moment after the laughter, after the drive home, after the front door closed, when she stood alone in her room and asked herself a question no magazine could answer for her. Is this love? Is this safety? Is this enough? Is this my life, or only the life I was taught to want? That question mattered, because history does not only change in speeches or protests or headlines. Sometimes it changes in a girl deciding she will wait, in a woman refusing a proposal, in a wife admitting she wants partnership, not performance, in a daughter quietly choosing a different future than the one everyone assumed for her. The 1950s are often remembered as a decade of certainty. But underneath, it was also a decade of women beginning, sometimes softly, sometimes secretly, to trust their own uncertainty. And that uncertainty was not weakness. It was intelligence. It was self-preservation. It was the beginning of choice. The old world said being chosen was the goal. But many women were slowly discovering that the deeper task was choosing for themselves. Choosing what kind of love they would accept. Choosing what kind of marriage they believed in. Choosing whether respectability was worth silence. Choosing whether security without selfhood was truly security at all. Those choices did not always look dramatic. Often they looked like hesitation, a delayed engagement, a difficult conversation, a quiet no, a life that unfolded differently than planned. But history is full of quiet revolutions. And perhaps that is why this story still feels familiar. Because even now, across very different lives, many people still ask some version of the same question. How do you know whether love is asking you to become more yourself or less? The women of 1950s America asked that question too, even if they were not always allowed to say it plainly. They asked it at dances, in church pews, college dorm windows, in suburban kitchens, on telephone lines stretched with waiting, and on front porches where a simple goodnight could carry the weight of an entire future. Their world was different, Their rules were stricter, their choices were narrower, but their hopes were recognizably human. To be loved honestly, to be respected fully, to build a life that felt like their own. That was never a small desire, and perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath all the old photographs. Behind every perfect smile, every engagement ring, every carefully staged wedding portrait, there was a real woman trying to decide not just who she would marry, but who she would be. If that part of the story surprised you most, I'd love to know. Which detail of 1950s dating felt hardest to imagine living through? And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, subscribe and come back for the next one. There is always another ordinary-looking piece of history hiding a much deeper human story.